Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today to this Majlis, which is looking exciting. Fozia is probably my best friend amongst all people whom I've never met in person yet. I've been always impressed by her, not just as a scholar, but also as a kind, empathetic, warm, wise, and witty person. Once, to conclude a discussion about the miseries of academic life, she formulated for me this ultimate motto: let's enjoy it as an act of resistance. So today she will also talk about resistance, and I'm absolutely sure that we will enjoy it. Fozia, please.
Thank you so much, Istvan. I've really appreciated our friendship. As you said, we've never met, but I feel we have met at some level, not just through screens. It's been a meeting of minds. I'm really honored to be here, to be talking about this subject, which is now very close to my heart, which is the subject of my current research, for which I have some research leave. And I'm really privileged to be doing something quite different from what I've been doing for the previous few years. So some of you may, so I know some people in the room already. I know Sajjad Rizvi, I know Chris Gaffney, and a few others. So some of you may know that I'm, in my previous life, been a medievalist, as we call it in academia. In other words, my focus has been on classical Islamic subjects, particularly historiography, Arabic historiography of the so-called medieval period. This project is for me a pivot into a different direction, into a more modern history, and into a history that's much more local. And that modernness and its localness have been quite important for me in my kind of journey, intellectual journey into history and historiography and the use of archives and so forth. Mainly because it's a history which I feel touches my life in a way that perhaps the medieval topics I've previously done have not done in the same way. So that's kind of a bit about the reason why I'm here as a supposed medievalist addressing you on a modern history subject. And I appreciate that this Majlis is broad in its scope. So the project I wanted to talk about today, and I'll share my screen now, is the beginning of a kind of a collaboration between a few people who I'll mention in a moment. And it's an attempt to recover the archival history of a historical episode, which is a ethnographic village that came to Bradford in 1904. It's an attempt to understand what this episode was in the context of Bradford as a city and in the context of the UK as a whole, but also in the context, so there are several overlapping contexts through which we're viewing this history. Another context is the history of these kinds of ethnographic shows more generally across the globe, the display of racialized and colonized people in Western cities. I say Western because we're speaking mostly about Europe, but also North America. The practice of displaying colonized people in this way through this particular model dates back to the mid-19th century, and formally the practice stopped around 1958, but I would argue that it's never gone away. There are still iterations of the ethnographic village or the native village or the model village that you see in various parts of the world, including in the formerly colonized world itself. And so some of the challenges around the ways to interpret a history like this history, I think pertain to our lives today, and the perennial issues of racialization and othering and marginalization, and the epistemological impacts of that othering and marginalization. So I hope this talk will provide kind of some talking points. I'm grateful to be able to share these initial framings with you. And I hope to get some feedback because there are many people that I know in the audience who probably will have insights and questions around this topic. So I've named this topic Anti-Colonial Resistance in a Human Zoo, so-called human zoo in inverted commas, subverting the archive of Bradford's 1904 Somali village. The images you see are shots taken from the Somali village, and I'll say more about the photography, the archive of photography, a bit further on in the talk. Okay. So I'll begin by giving kind of a little bit of a historical outline around what the village was and what we've discovered about the people who came and what they did and their reaction to being in Bradford, but also the reaction of Bradfordians to them, not just Bradfordians, but people more generally in these sort of encounters between colonizers and the colonized. Then I'll speak a bit about the sort of inklings of anti-colonial resistance, both explicit and implicit, in this space of encounter. And then I'll say a bit about the framing of this sort of village as a show, an ethnographic show. In the German archive, in the German scholarship, they're called Volksschauen or people shows. And in the Somali language, they're called Arwo, sometimes spelt with a C at the beginning, Arwo meaning people of the fair, exhibition, and so on, which underscores the fact that this was a profession and a way of life for a certain number of people, an unknown number of people in Somalia. I'll say a bit about the ethnographic village as a space of negotiation, of struggle, but also of self-assertion, in which we have a few examples of the people in Bradford in 1904, the ways in which they asserted their needs and kicked back against certain expectations and certain forms of pressure. And in this, I'll be drawing on some of the framings of the sort of encounter provided by Ali Mazrui, by Mary Louise Pratt, by Sven Lindqvist, and others. So I put 4 framings and provided only 3 names. The 4th name is Annette Hoffman, who has produced a wonderful account of a member of a troupe that came to Germany in a bit later in our village, sort of through the 1910s onwards, called Muhammad Noor. And so she's also provided some very interesting readings of how you read against the grain of the archive to uncover a kind of a subversive history, if you like. I'll end by thinking a bit about whether the Bradford village was a typical village insofar as there were different models of engagement of people for these villages and different ways in which people were handled, different levels of agency and, let's say, care given to people in these ethnographic shows. Some were better organized, others were actually very starkly exploitative, and people were treated extremely badly. So I'll say a bit about Bradford in that context of a range of different practices associated with the Volksschauen or Arwo. And then I'll say a bit about reading behind the obvious sort of history outlined in the European archives with recourse to some of the insights we get from the Somali archive, of which there is relatively little material available at the moment, although we hope through our research to gain a bit more of that line of inquiry. Okay, so that's a bit about the outline of the talk today. I want to begin by paying tribute to my colleagues in the project. This project could not have happened without the strong collaboration at the heart of it. And the research I'll share today, I'm leaning heavily on the work of 2 colleagues in particular, Bodri Warsami, who is a leading historian of the Arwo. He's based in Sweden, and his 2021 paper on, it's called Staged Otherness. I really recommend it to anyone. It's available online. It's freely available. There are no barriers to access. It's a brilliant piece in which I would say that he rewrites and let's say kind of reinterprets the meaning of the Arwo as not just a space of exploitation, which it clearly was, but also a space of agency and opportunity for the people who came, albeit in the conditions of kind of coloniality at home and abroad. The other researcher I want to pay tribute to is Yahya Burt, historian of the Muslim community in the UK, and he's a research associate with Everyday Muslim, and he's done a lot of the work on the Yorkshire archive as well. My other colleagues are, well, there are several, but on the research side, we have Christopher Gaffney and Ben Jennings, based at the University of Bradford. They are professors of archaeology, and they've been doing important work on the location of the village, work above and below ground, to give us an insight into the contours of the village and the kinds of activities that took place there as evidence in the archaeological record. So that's also been pioneering work. And then we have two PhD students who are going to be looking more at the archival dimensions and also the religious practices that were displayed in the Somali village of Bradford. So that's the research team. I'm currently on research leave, 50% of my workload in order to work on this project, and I'll mention a bit later on the kind of outputs that we're hoping to achieve together as a team. The team is much bigger than this group of researchers, but I'm focusing right now on the research aspects since this is a kind of research-based talk. I'll begin by, with a very specific location, which is a cemetery in the city of Bradford called Skolmo Cemetery. Skolmo Cemetery is a huge cemetery, and it has a section, a Muslim section, in which there are scores and scores of graves marking the resting places of many of Bradford's Muslim community, most of them of South Asian background. Many of you may know that Bradford is a city in which many South Asians have settled over the decades, and it also has the largest Rohingya population in the UK, and many other ethnicities, including from Eastern Europe and elsewhere. In this cemetery, there is one grave which we believe is Bradford's first Muslim grave, and that's the grave of a young woman called Halimo Abdo Bedel, a young Somali woman who died aged 26 in the Somali village of 2004. It's a really poignant place. It's a permanent memorial to the fact that a group of Somalis came and spent 6 months in Bradford. Their stay was temporary, but her death in the village and her burial in Bradford gives the village a lasting imprint in the city's cityscape. It's also, I think, an important place to mark for the local Muslim community and the people in the city at large. And I would say it's also a good place for those who wish to pay their respects, to almost see it as a pilgrimage site, because it pays tribute to a way of life and almost a mode of existence and resistance, which is very little understood, particularly when you look at the way in which Bradford's history has been marked and recorded over the decades. The history of the Somali villages is virtually absent in the historical record. And this was one of the main reasons why this project has become so important. It's a forgotten history, but a really important history for many different reasons, which I hope we can talk about towards the end of the presentation. So I've mentioned that this was an ethnographic village, and to put that into context, the ethnographic village was a key part of the imperial propaganda, which Mackenzie has highlighted in the quote that you probably can't see because it's so small. But in this quotation, we read Mackenzie describing a combination of entertainment, education, and imperial propaganda. The backdrop to these ethnographic displays was usually colonial wars of different kinds, the development of colonial infrastructure, and a need to justify the incursion into new territories or the building up of imperial institutions. The migration of people to the colonies was a central part of that, and many imperial exhibitions, including world fairs, trade fairs, industrial fairs, and so on, which took place in many cities in the Western world, would often have an emigration bureau where individuals could sign up to visit the colonies to perhaps relocate to them. So these imperial exhibitions had multiple functions. and an ethnographic village was often part of the entertainment or even the main kind of thing on offer. We can date the start of these exhibitions to around 1850, but that is a kind of notional beginning insofar as the ethnographic village developed out of the circus, it developed out of the freak show. And when one embarks on a discussion of these kinds of ethnographic villages, often the assumption is that these must be akin to the freak shows. Many of you will have heard or perhaps watched Nadifa Muhammad's Human Zoo documentary, which I think is very powerful in outlining the horror and the extreme violence, both physical and cultural, the violence of these kinds of freak shows. The ethnographic village is on a different kind of model, insofar as the emphasis is more on so-called authenticity, less on the masquerade, less on exoticization in the more in its more stark form. So the point of in time where we open our story in Bradford in 1904, the ethnographic village is a different kind of phenomenon, insofar as it's a response to previous doubts around authenticity that were raised by audiences. And so the idea is that with the ethnographic village, people come and they perform their ways of life without barriers often. In other words, not on a stage. And the emphasis is on this being an educational experience underpinned by science, the sciences of ethnography, but also pseudosciences like physiognomy, the study of the human face, or phrenology, the study of the shape of the skull, which were treated as credible sciences until the late 19th century. So when our story opens in 1904, you have the kind of after waves or after effects of this kind of pseudoscience, still kind of, let's say, which are there as a sort of miasma around these displays, but there's a veneer of kind of jolliness, a veneer of joyfulness even, because this particular village and many others like it are seen as great days out for the family, where you can buy a ticket to see a real African community living its normal life in the Yorkshire countryside. I'll say a bit more about the mix of performance and authenticity a bit later on, but the key point is that this type of encounter touched the lives of many. It touched the lives of, in Bradford at least, 350 plus thousand visitors to the Somali village. In the context of the worldwide phenomenon of the ethnographic villages, we know that something like 35,000 people, colonized people, were brought to Western cities to perform their culture. Something like 1.5 billion tickets were sold, and they were completely central to European imperial culture. I mean, I could say more about social Darwinism and so forth, and underlying the idea of there being a hierarchy of races and so on. But I think I'll sort of leave it there to sort of set the scene really for what happened in Bradford in 1904. In terms of the reasons why the Horn of Africa was a particular location for recruiting people to these villages, the villages were peopled by communities from all over the colonized world, including India, Sri Lanka, including the Far East, including Inuit people from North America. So there were all kinds of ethnographic villages. The particular sort of historical context for the Somali village of 1904 in Bradford was the UK in Africa. So in 1869, with the opening of the Suez Canal, there was the opportunity to have a different kind of relationship with the continent of Africa. And in 1870, the scramble for Africa began, which led to around 90% of the African continent coming under direct imperial control. Somalia at the time was subject to a colonial struggle between the French, the British, and the Italians, which led to a division of that region into French Djibouti, British Somaliland, and Italian Somaliland. The villagers who came to Bradford in 1904 are thought to have come from the Djibouti region. This, I say thought to have come because we have very little hard data around the people who came, their backgrounds, their family histories, even their clan membership and so on. But we're beginning to find some insights into those stories, which I'll say more about later. The relationship of the British with their colony in Somaliland was extremely fraught. They had 4 campaigns in the region, and they were beset by anti-colonial resistance, much of it led by Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, who they dubbed the Mad Mullah, which is of course a highly pejorative title. He was actually a Sufi of the Salihiyya order, and he achieved a certain number of victories against the British, despite the fact that he and his men had much fewer resources at their disposal than the heavily armed British. So this relationship of antagonism brought about by the British in their kind of attempts to colonize and maintain their colony in British Somaliland forms the backdrop to the arrival of Somalis to Bradford in 1904. So another kind of dimension to the relationship between Somalis and the rest of the world, which again is sort of needs to be framed by the colonial context, is that Somalis were often recruited, yes, for ethnographic shows, but also for other kinds of labor. A key example is Somali seamen who came to British cities and formed communities in port cities like Cardiff, and those communities are there to this day. And in that sense, the Somalis who came to Bradford in 1904 and spent only 6 months here, although they were a temporary presence, I think it's important to put them in the context, or their presence in the context of Somali movement to the UK in different forms. There were Somali troops, and by troops, I mean Arwa people coming to Britain or other parts of the world for the purposes of putting on an ethnographic village or show. So we had Somali troops, different troops, not always the same group, who came to London in 1895, 1905, 1911, 1924, Bradford 1904, Dublin 1907, 1912, Edinburgh 1910, and Douglas in 1912 in the Isle of Man. So there were a number of different, let's say, villages that were formed. There was some overlap in the personnel between some of these different villages, and often a group of them would be managed by the same troop leader. I'll say a bit about that in a second, but this is important because what we know about the way in which Somalis were recruited to the shows is that there would be a business person, an impresario, who would sometimes in a private capacity and sometimes in the capacity of working for a colonial or civic administration, would go out and meet with brokers on the ground in Somalia. The brokers on the ground would put them in touch with troop leaders, and the troop leaders would put together a group. The group might be people who are already connected to each other through family, through marriage, through kinship ties, or they may be people who are more disparate, who come together for the purposes of the performance and the show. We are still working out, and I think, as I said, Badri Warsami is a great expert on this topic. We're still working out the mechanics by which someone would join a troop. There is some scholarship, there's a couple of books which have discussed 2 particular case studies of how people were recruited to these shows. They were these were often seen as business opportunities. So in our group of researchers, we've had a range of responses to this kind of history, in which some of our Somali collaborators and partners and researchers have talked about the ethnographic show as a way of life, a profession, which is not shameful. Rather, it's an indication of Somali resilience in the face of colonial oppression and the depredations of their land, their resources, their opportunities for agricultural activity. Certainly the Somalis who were recruited to the shows would have things that they could make and sell, artifacts and so forth, through blacksmithery, through weaving, through pottery and so on. So there's a mix of opportunity and pressure from home. I mentioned Annette Hoffman earlier on. She's produced a wonderful study of Muhammad Noor, as I mentioned before, a Somali who came to Germany. And her work on the linguistic archive from Germany in the early 20th century reveals that Muhammad Noor gave her linguistic examples of Somali language in which he actually refers to his own life and the kind of reasons why he joined the ethnographic show that he did. And that's a very rare insight into the kind of Somali experience of the ethnographic show. And in that we see that he was short of money. He was slightly at a loose end as things were unstable back home, not least because of the anti-colonial, let's say, successes of Abdullah Hassan. And he was persuaded to join a troupe going to Germany just for a year, as he thought at the time, in order to earn some money. Now, Muhammad Noor was a religious scholar and a teacher. So for him, he was promised, if you like, a job to teach children in the village for a year, and then he would return home. That's not exactly what happened. There's a long story of how he fared, and he had a very difficult time, which I won't go into now. I mean, it's a long and fascinating story, but the key point about that story is that we see that there were pressures back home to find alternative ways of earning a living. So the means by which Somalis came was not always uniform, but there was a certain mix of needing to find new markets for the wares they were selling. And in some cases, we could surmise that people who became good at this way of life would often seek new opportunities to join other shows because they had become adept at putting on these performances, but also adept at traveling and putting up with all of the difficulties that entitled, including difficulties of climate, difficulties of the travel itself, and the difficulties of being in environments where basically you're at the receiving end of different kinds of treatment at the hands of showrunners. You're at the mercy of their particular ways of doing business. So the Somali troupe that came to Bradford in 1904 came from the Djibouti-Ethiopian border, and they were recruited by an impresario called Victor Bamberger. Victor Bamberger was a Viennese businessman, and he had some experience of a previous show, and he put together a troupe with the help of Sultan Ali Al-Urfa, who was the troupe leader of Bradford. The group that came to Bradford consisted of 57 people, men, women, and children. They spent 2 months in France, in Nice. They did some shows there, and then they went to Marseille, and then they came to Bradford. The interesting thing about the Bradford gig is that originally an Ashanti village was meant to come. Now, some of the descriptions of the villages has to be taken with a pinch of salt, insofar as the same group of people could sometimes be packaged as an Ashanti group, or an Ethiopian group, or an Abyssinian group, or a Somali group. In other words, they were seen as interchangeably representative of an East African culture. So the group that came to Bradford, they came in May, and they spent until October in Bradford. They stayed in a park called Lister Park, and I'll come to that in a second. The same group went on to tour Europe for another decade. We are not completely sure whether all of the people that came to Bradford were the same as those who went on to Europe. This is an open line of inquiry. We're looking at the moment at any coincidence of names between those who went to Bradford and those who went on to Germany the year after, but also we're looking at the photographic archives to see if we can see the same faces. We're also going to be using some software to help us match faces from photography as well. So the Sultan Ali troop did have a long life, but the members of that troop were variable. Some people might come only for a short tour. Others went on to join troop after troop after troop. Okay, there was a bit of a rivalry between imperial powers around recruitment to these shows. We know this from statements provided by Hirsi Egegorse, a troop leader from who worked in Germany for the most part, but also in England. And he was head of a really successful troop that came back to Europe year after year after year. It was an extremely well-organized group. Badri Warsami's article does a deeper case study of this group. And this troop leader, Hirsi Egegorse, mentions that the British and the Germans were both keen that he would work with them. And when he worked with the British, this angered the Germans and vice versa. So there is imperial rivalry on the ethnographic troops. Why would this be the case? Because the ethnographic shows were extremely lucrative. They were, as I said before, key to imperial propaganda, but they were also massive money spinners. There came a point later on in the around the 1910s onwards where some less well-organized troops did not make money, and some troops were left stranded, highly mistreated. There's a troop that came to Bradford a few years after the 1904 troop. They came to be part of a place called the Coliseum, and they were so badly treated that the authorities had to intervene and fine the showrunner. They were left in a store cupboard without sanitary conditions for some weeks, without access to fresh air. So the life of the ethnographic troop, or the members of the ethnographic troop, was highly risky and precarious. But that precarity could be mitigated if the troop leader was a strong person, well organized, and it could also be mitigated if the showrunners were true to their responsibilities and took proper care of the troop members. Some of the kind of labor forces that came from the colonized world to the colonial centers were treated in ways much more brutal than the people of ethnographic shows. For example, if you were a laborer coming to join a workforce in some other capacity and you didn't behave, then you could be pushed overboard on your passage to the your Western destination. So the life as a whole was highly precarious. The particular troops that came to the West were highly dependent on the goodwill and the good practices of the people who brought them over. So turning now to the people who came, the Somalis who came to Bradford in 1904, we know that the 6 months that they spent in Bradford, and this was a new troop, was a very challenging one for them. This is because although they came in the summer months, May to October, that year was not a warm year, and the Somalis would often be huddled around stoves. They came with some materials to build their own huts. That was one of the kind of, let's say, performative aspects for the authenticity angle. They would brought materials with them to build their huts using their own well-developed technologies of hut building, or the aql, and they brought materials to build their own huts. In Bradford, we know that the backdrop wall of the village and some of the kind of fencing was actually built by a local Yorkshireman, but the Somalis then built the rest of their huts, if you like. And the number of huts is not known to me, but we know that there were a number, because 4 burnt down at one point, which is a story I'll come back to later. The expectation was that they would perform in the village as part of the Great Exhibition of Bradford for most of the daylight hours. So they had long working days in which they would provide a mix of everyday life and performance. Performance could include spear throwing, it could include songs, it could include dancing, and the everyday life would include things like cooking, washing, praying together in congregation. So the Somalis were all Muslim. Children learnt their lessons in Arabic on a daily basis. It's not absolutely clear how much the performance was performative rather than what Somalis would ordinarily do had they not come to Bradford. But what we can say is that there is an element of fusing the performance and the everyday life. In the context of the exhibition as a whole, this was a civic-led industrial exhibition on the model of the great exhibitions that you see in other cities around the time. It was considered a great success. This is a time when Bradford has already reached the peak of its success as an industrial city. So it's kind of on the wane almost. And nevertheless, the exhibition was a way to show off technological innovation, including baby incubators and weaving machines and so on. Bradford was known as Worcesterdopolis, a capital of the textile industry, and the exhibition as a whole had many important, mostly temporary buildings. An industrial hall and a concert hall were built on a huge grand scale, just for the 6 months of the exhibition. And at the end of the 6 months, the materials would be dismantled and sold on or auctioned off. The exhibition attracted 2.4 million visitors in those 6 months. £13,000 were generated, which is several million today's money. And the current Cartwright Hall, which if any of you know the park, which I know some of you do, was also inaugurated at this exhibition. Cartwright Hall is now a gallery, and some of its artwork was paid for by the proceeds of the Somali village. People who paid to come to the exhibition as a whole would pay extra to enter the village, the Somali village, and the Somali village was considered to be the most successful aspect of all the entertainments on offer. The entertainments included a roller coaster and a water shoot and other kind of sort of elements to make it an enjoyable day out for families that visited. Nearly 350,000 people came to the Somali village alone. They would be able to enter the village, which did not have barriers. They would be able to view the villages up close, and on the payment of an extra fee to the villagers themselves, they would be able to take photographs of them. So part of our project has been collecting the photographic archive of the Somali village. The vast majority of pictures that we've seen are staged for the purposes of making postcards, which were another side hustle for the showrunners. There was a postcard selling stand near to the entrance of the village. One of the things that Mackenzie spoke about from the quote I shared earlier was that the ephemeral nature of these exhibitions meant that the kind of capturing them through photography became very, very important, because this was a way to kind of mitigate the kind of ephemerality, if you like, and leave a more permanent record. So there's a huge range of postcards available of these ethnographic shows, and certainly a few dozen available of our village, showing the villagers in different poses, in different circumstances, and doing different kinds of activities. Because this is a history which really belongs to the Somali community, we haven't rushed to share the photographic archive, even though I'm using some of the images here for illustrative purposes. And this is because the whole idea of display and for the purposes of the white gaze is, as you can imagine, extremely fraught. And the purpose of our project, and perhaps I should have, kind of mentioned this at the start, is to return this history to its ownership, to its proper ownership, which is the Somali community, both in the UK and worldwide. And so the objective, one of the objectives, is to collect these postcards and to consult with our Somali researchers and partners to think about the best way to make this available, but also to perhaps use them as a prompt for people who might wish to think about their own ancestors who may have been part of these ethnographic tours, and see if we can fill in gaps in the archive through oral histories as well. So there are kind of different ways in which we want to use the photography of the Somali village to kind of, I would say, primarily for the use of the Somali community, but also more widely if that's deemed appropriate. The poses in which you see the Somalis, they're of course highly staged, and they are meant to depict people who feel joyful in their presence in Bradford. And of course, that has to be taken with a great degree of skepticism. At the same time, you see glimpses of shots that are unstaged, and you see kids playing, you see women doing their work. And so to that extent, I think we can sort of go with and against the photographic archive at the same time. In other words, to both take them at face value, but also see the images which are less staged and see what they reveal. I'll give an example of some images which are more challenging. I'll come back to this slide in a second, but if we look at, for example, this particular photograph, this was only unearthed recently. This shows Lord Masham, Samuel Lister, we believe, and the former Lord Mayor and Chairman of the exhibition's Executive Committee, Councillor William Lupton, inspecting Bradford's Somali village. And here you see the lack of a barrier between the white gaze and the villagers. It's actually quite disturbing if you see both the white visitors and the Somalis in the same shot, because then you see the level of dehumanization and the level of objectification, and the racial gaze is made much more stark. So in that sense, these photographs that depict both the ones looking and the ones looked at, I think are much more, are kind of quite important for our understanding of what these spaces of encounter were like. It's a point I can come back to later on, I hope. Okay, so I think I probably need to hurry slightly. I want to, oh yes, I should hurry. That's a bit about the village itself.
Fozia,
yeah.
No need to hurry.
Okay.
Yeah, it is extremely interesting. So don't hurry.
Okay, thank you. So this is Lister Park, an aerial shot, and this is the location of the village. I could say more, but I'm gonna I'm going to move on. We know a bit about from the archival record, the kind of the numbers of visitors that came, and we also know about how much revenue they generated. The Somalis came through, they were recruited to contracts or by contracts of employment. They were not captured, they were not forced, as far as we know. The contracts were highly asymmetric insofar as they were paid really what in our terms, in today's terms, would be well below the minimum wage for long hours of work. It's kind of difficult to put exact figures on it in today's terms because they were, of course, also fed and clothed and so forth. But ultimately, they took back with them relatively little in terms of profit. This is in contrast to the other troop that I mentioned that came to Germany, the Hirsi Ege Gorse troop, where the profits generated were much higher. It was a much more professional and long-standing group, better organized. And Hirsi Ege Gorse, he earned enough money to be able to send lots of money back home to provide funds for building of infrastructure. He also purchased loads of German sewing machines, which he sent back to Somalia, and that reinvigorated some of the clothing industry. So that was one model of seeing these villages as an income stream. But in Bradford, this was not the case. Only the Sultan Ali earned a decent amount, and his Hakim earned a certain amount as well. The workers could supplement their income through selling their handicrafts, such as pottery and fabrics. But really, we're talking about quite marginal levels of income. The Somalis were expected to take money from visitors who were taking photographs, but some people would come and take photographs and not pay them, and that led to sometimes to disputes between the villagers and the visitors. There were certain episodes in those 6 months which really stand out in the archival record for the kind of impact they had on the Somalis. One was a fire that broke out on August 30th in the village. We don't have absolute clinching evidence as to why the fire broke out. In the newspaper reporting, some have said could it have been an electrical fault or a stove that wasn't attended to properly. But there was a young man who was selling postcards in a kiosk near to the entrance of the village. He gave testimony at the time that he had been telling people not to give the kids in the village matches to play with for fear of starting a fire, and visitors continued to give the kids in the village matches, and that could have been a cause of the fire. Anyway, it took some time for the fire brigade to arrive. It was a case of bringing the fire hoses down from the industrial hall on the same park further up, and it took some time. And in that time, 4 huts burnt down. 2 contained the troops' valuables, which had been amassed by Sultan Ali. It was a huge loss. Extremely valuable artifacts were lost. The Somalis expected that they would be compensated through insurance for these losses. Luckily, no one lost their lives, no one was injured, but the loss of material property was quite considerable. However, the authorities, the civic authorities, refused to take responsibilities, and there was no compensation for the loss of artifacts. There was a nominal compensation for some Western clothing, but that's all. And as a result, on the last day of on the day of their departure, the Somalis went to the town hall in Bradford, in the city centre, and they picketed the town hall to demand compensation. The civic authorities refused very quickly. In a hastily convened meeting, they refused to honour this insurance claim, this claim for compensation. It does show, however, that the Somalis took their business venture really seriously. It wasn't just a performance or a show or an adventure in travel, but rather an opportunity to make money, which was then, of course, ruined by this fire. Okay, so this is a depiction of the ways in which the Somalis were viewed at the time in the newspapers. So here you have some of the kind of industrial machinery and so on, Lord Masham, Samuel Lister, and then scenes from village life. I'm not sure you can see whether you can see this very clearly, but here you see boys at spear practice, a blacksmith with his bellows, I think it's someone getting their hair cut, and so on and so forth, somebody hanging some artifacts to be sold. So the village attracted a huge amount of buzz in the press, and this was one reason why the show was such a success. Word spread very rapidly, and people read about the village and wanted to come and visit. This is the centenary brochure produced by Cartwright Hall of the village. I'm not going to say much about this because it will take too much time, but it's kind of basically a kind of sanitized a kind of account of the village. We can, come back to that if we have time. I've discussed this kind of photography. One of the purposes of embarking on the project, because now I'm moving into the sort of issue of interpretation and the anti-colonial resistance. One of the motivations for embarking on this history is that we've kind of as a group of researchers, we've heard kind of loud and clear from both our own research community, but also putting this into context of different kinds of, let's say, anti-colonial strands of research, both within and outside university settings, that the emphasis with these kinds of phenomena is often on the, let's say, the shame and guilt attached to colonial practices of discrimination, of brutalization, of exploitation. But the human stories of those who were exploited, colonized, and abused is often missing in that kind of navel-gazing, mea culpa type of scholarship or kind of observation. And so part of the rationale behind this project is to reverse the colonial gaze, to put the emphasis and the spotlight on the very sort of rich lives of the people who came, in as much as that can be gleaned. Asma Jama, a Somali poet, she made a statement on a website where she spoke about her people who were depicted in the photographic archive of these types of ethnographic shows, and she makes a poignant point that often we know so little about them. Where is the emphasis or the attention to their lives, their names, their histories, their stories, their biographies? So part of our research is biographical. It really is an important objective to try and recover the stories of some of the individuals. It's very challenging because we don't have a lot to go on, but we're doing what we can to put the call out, both in the UK and in Somalia and abroad, to try to connect with people who have a personal connection with these histories. So let's see what that yields in due course. So the Sultan Ali Djibouti troop, or configurations thereof, i.e. the troops led by Sultan Ali, came to Bradford from France, went on to Cologne, Oldenburg, and other places. You see a list here, and we know of their last fixture was in Odessa. The story of this particular village is one we're trying to trace. So we do have snippets of information of other troops where they were abandoned by the showrunners. For example, Victor Bamberger, who brought this particular group to Bradford, a few years later, he abandoned another troop in Odessa, and he left them there, and they had to be repatriated back to Somalia. And the colonial authorities fought with each other, or kind of had a dispute with each other about who should pay for their passage back home. But this is a kind of inkling of the precarity of this sort of way of life. Nevertheless, the Sultan Ali Djibouti troop was fairly successful, at least for some years, before it fizzled out. They were eventually also in the US, and they were deported from there. again, kind of a story that I don't have time to go into right now. But this is Sultan Ali in the white robes, and these are some of his so-called bodyguards. I say so-called because, of course, these are often tableaus put on for the public. The Yorkshire European Archive, the press and periodicals, and also the official reports from the City Council and minutes of meetings and so on yield quite a lot from the kind of Bradfordian point of view. We also have photographs, official and unofficial. And then we have also the European archives, which also detail the travel of these groups onwards from Bradford. For example, shipping archives and so on. We know the names of some of the Bradford troop because they would often leave their compound in the park to go and play cricket with local cricket teams and so on and so forth. And from those, we can glean the names of some of the people who came. So we have Sultan Ali Orfa, or Urfa, as he's sometimes called, and then a number of men, a number of women, and a number of children. You can see more children's names because they're the ones who are named in the press as having played cricket with local teams. And Halimo Abdo Bedel is the young woman who passed away in 1904. Her story is very poignant. She had tuberculosis. She may have come with tuberculosis, that's what the archive tells us. She passed away in the care of her community. She was visited by Western doctors, a Bradfordian doctor, but really it was her community that took care of her. And she never left their care, and she was buried with all Islamic rites soon after she passed away. 3 days after she passed away, a baby was born in the village who was named Khadija Yorkshire, and she is also named in the list of children. She was said to be the daughter of the Sultan Ali and his wife Fatima. However, in a conversation with the civic authorities, Sultan Ali archly and wryly comments that, yes, she's meant to be my daughter, something to that effect. In other words, he's acknowledging or sort of indicating that sometimes these things were spin rather than reality. A baby was born. Whether she was his daughter or not is not absolutely clear. Why would it be important for him to have a daughter? Well, we think that the sadness of Halimo's death, which was really widely remarked in the press at the time, it kind of brought a somber air around the village. And a good news story like the birth of a baby just 3 days later was a way to reset the tone around the presence of Somalis in Bradford as part of this exhibition. Okay, I'm going to try and quickly move on. We have some ways we're sharing the stories that are coming out of this research. We have poetic documentary being made by Yusra Warsama. We have a book of essays. It's kind of early stages of kind of thinking about Somali knowledge systems and so on. These are all works in progress. We're hoping to have an e-zine created by young Somalis, a permanent memorial in Lister Park to mark the location of the village. We're preparing a schools pack for Bradford City of Culture 2025, where this story can be part of the history of migration in the city. And then we hope in the long term to have a travelling exhibition, which would perhaps bring together some of the stories of Somali ethnographic villages across these different locations to join them up into a coherent sort of understanding of this practice of the Arwa. Badr Barsami has reminded us really powerfully that we can think about the people of these ethnographic villages, yes, as exploited people in a racially charged, manipulative colonial environment. However, they never lost their will to survive, and they were agents for negotiating power. And he mentions the difficulties they experienced, including racial abuse, blackmail, overwork, fierce competition, and so forth. At the same time, he has characterized the people of the show as people of agency. And this brings me to some of the framings of this type of colonial encounter. So the Arwa, or the Somali word for exhibition, is the word we prefer to use. In the German scholarship, they're called Volksschauen, or people shows. We've avoided using the term human zoo because the term human zoo does not in any way capture the complex ways in which the Somalis in this instance, but also colonized people more generally in these ethnographic shows, expressed their needs, desires, and forms of agency, and their forms of resistance to the racialization and the exploitation they experienced as a kind of matter of course, as a kind of infrastructural reality. So some of the framings that we're using are Ali Mazroui's marvelous consideration of people of the Horn of Africa as having a triple heritage, the heritage of their indigenous African traditions, the heritage of Islam, which came to the Horn of Africa in the 7th century, so very early on in Islamic history. And the third part of their heritage is their encounter with the West, often through colonialism, but also through technology and globalization. So that multiple and complex layered identity is very much in evidence in the ways in which the Somalis experienced life in the Arwa, the Volkashal. We're also thinking about Mary Louise Pratt's discussion of the colonial encounter as a space of as a contact zone, a space of struggle, negotiation, even complicity, but ultimately that complicity is in the service of survival and resilience and a kind of reinvention of self under enormous pressure. We're also thinking about Sven Lindqvist's understanding of labor history coming from below, the idea that laborers take control of their own historical representation through an understanding of the institutions in which they worked and making that history public. So that's also that of dig where you stand is an inspirational model for us as well. We've avoided the term human zoo, but we are mindful that the scholarship, for example, as represented, for example, by this volume I have here, this French volume, which has important points to make about the connection between the Volkashau or the ethnographic village and modern racism. I think those are very important points. But the point of our project is not to center the white gaze in all of its problematic aspects, but rather to center the experience of Somalis in these shows and to see where we can contribute to a history that's been erased and forgotten, fill in the gaps, but also hopefully learn things that help us in our own positionality as people in multicultural and complex societies. So some of the ways in which you see inklings of anti-colonial resistance is, for example, when the the mullah, the imam of the group in Bradford, he gave a Friday sermon, and this was translated by Charles Hastings, one of the managers of the show, for the press into English. And that translation shows you that he wasn't really speaking to his community. He was telling them quite basic things about Islam, and his audience was actually the visitors to the show. In other words, it's a kind of a form of missionizing to show off Islam to the visitors. Now, you could say, well, isn't that part of this performance? Well, actually, this was more specifically about showing Islam in the best light, something which wasn't highlighted as part of the performance. The performance was more about kind of cultural aspects like spear throwing, singing, and so forth. In June of 1904, Sultan Ali spoke with admiration for the anti-colonial leader Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, the so-called Mad Mullah, as a very big and powerful man, a great fighter, and who'd been the cause of a great deal of trouble to England. These were risque comments in the context in which Britain was fighting these very violent wars in Somaliland, but he shows that he has full admiration for the anti-colonial Sufi leader Abdullah Hassan. The picketing of the town hall was again an assertion of their rights as workers and their unhappiness with the fact that they had been swindled out of their compensation they were entitled to. And when on the last day in Bradford, the Somalis exchanged their white calico robes or kind of indigenous dress for Western dress, this generated surprise, and it underlines for us that even their way of dressing was part of their performance. It does raise the question, though, about kind of performance versus versus, let's say, self-assertion. I'll come back to that in a second as my last point. But the theory of the Arwa has certain operational aspects. So on the one hand, we can see the people who came as laborers under contract in a colonial contact zone, bringing their multiple heritages into play. That still raises many questions about the operational dimensions of the Arwa and the variables thereof. For example, whether involvement stable or precarious or short-lived. Some people, as I said before, would come onto these shows year after year after year, and they would adapt their performance, adapt their ways of advertising their businesses and so on. Another variable is a clan leader with a clan root versus a composite group of performers. In other words, how natural was that collection of people, if that's the right word? And then were the shows sponsored by private businesses or through civic or colonial authorities? This made a difference because those who were sponsored by civic authorities had more recourse to redress of any grievances than those being managed by, sponsored by private businessmen. Long residence versus touring. Touring took its toll, and we know of a number of people in the Somali Arwa who passed away. I can think of at least 2 instances. So you have Halimo, but also I think 2 other instances I can think of on the continent who passed away. So this was not an easy way of life. Some shows were held indoors, others were held outdoors, and all of the implications of that, and so on. So I'm going to skip over a little bit. Some shows had scripted events and some had unscripted events. Scripted events could be a staged marriage, a birth. Of course, births were natural, but how they're presented could be the subject of a certain amount of spin. And then you had unscripted events, for example, the divorce that took place in Bradford and the death of Halimo. The divorce, we're still trying to work out exactly what happened there. The trace is very slight in the archival record, but the death is well documented. And then you have the question of the staged identity of the Somalis versus their actual identity. And this really brings me to my final reflections on the presence of the Somalis in Bradford in 1904. The kind of reading that we're coming towards when we think about this kind of experience in this colonial encounter is that the performative selves of the Arwa were also that was also a political act, insofar as this was a way to negotiate a place for themselves within the colonial infrastructure in ways that subverted some of the framings that the colonial authorities themselves provided. For example, the polyphony of the Mullah's khutbah that I talked about earlier. And then we can also read against the epistemic violence of the archive to think about the movement from pseudoscience, phrenology, and so on towards labor history, history from below, and the overlooked epistemologies of the Somalis from their knowledge of hut building, all that entails, the knowledge of climate, hydrology, and so on, their learning of lessons in the village, their making of objects, their blacksmithery, their weaving of textiles, and so on. There are so many ways in which they were creating and building and developing themselves and others, which is really overlooked in the historical record. We're using a certain amount of creative fabulation to help fill gaps in our knowledge through, I mentioned the poetic documentary, but we're also going to be looking at, through Bodhari's help and the help of others, the poetry, the stories, the folk memory, which may not be kind of, let's say, the same as a historical record, but rather they allow us to understand how the Arwa have been received in Somali history. And that is an important aspect to explore. What's the legacy of the Arwa in terms of self-identity in this formerly colonized community, but by extension into the learnings for other formerly colonized people. And we see that no local history, including the history of Bradford, is untouched by the global transactions and depredations of empire. So it's so important that the city of Bradford and its history are put in the context of empire, and that isn't really currently done at all. We see the Arwa teachers and preachers speak back through the archival traces, and we have Halimo's grave, which is a permanent memorial in Bradford to a people and their precarious profession. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Fozia. This was just fascinating. I really loved it. Uh, I'm sure we have plenty of questions, and I don't really know what to do. Normally, I would go to the questions directly. You kind of sacrificed your own story for the sake of your talk. Would you tell us some words about how did you become before we start before we finish the recording and before we start the questions and the discussion, to how did you become a historian of medieval Islam, first of all, and then also how did you turn to this new field? Though I can see the connection, but also the specific difficulties of dealing with a more recent material, more
Yeah.
recent lives.
Thank you. So my journey into studying history in the academic sphere was not planned. I was a journalist for some years before I came back to academia, but I went into Islamic history because I really had personal questions around the kind of origins of the religion and its source texts and the context in which those source texts appeared and so on. So something very personal turned into an MPhil and then a DPhil. And I ended up looking at manuscripts in the Bodleian Library and in other libraries in Europe that were kind of had not been touched. You can still find manuscripts not touched in the kind of Islamic context, which perhaps is not so common in other contexts. And I had a real love for history and historiography and kind of tracing the history of books through their presence in other books, if you like, because many books were not extant, but you'd find traces of them in later accounts. So I really enjoyed that journey of kind of uncovering book history through later accounts. I came to this project because part of my teaching at Leeds is around decolonial history and anti-colonial history and local histories. And I was told by a colleague about something called a human zoo in a Bradford park. And I live in Bradford, and this park is my local park. So it's quite a resonant story. It has a lot of personal resonance for me. And so, of course, I was intrigued. And so, with the help of Yahya, who I mentioned before, we connected up with a few other people, and we found that this is actually an untapped history, which I think has immense importance for the Somali community, but also for local Muslims in Bradford. And so I've pivoted towards it because I think if you really want to work not just in the academy but outside of the academy and bring some of the privilege of the academy and its resources to bear on communities not in that space, then I think you have to think carefully about what kind of topics you tackle and how you spend your time. So this has been a way to connect with the local community and with the Somali community as well. Of course, when I say Somali community, it's very diverse, and we have, professors in our group and artists and curators and all sorts. So it's really both a decision to do history in a different kind of way and give back, but also for me and others to learn so much more about methods and tools and ways of engaging communities that I haven't done before. So it's been exhilarating from that point of view. So I hope that gives some insights, Istvan.
Thank you very much. It's great you managed to summarize it in so briefly. I just want to say, everyone, I take full responsibility for the human zoo in the title of this talk. But this is actually, I think it's interesting because Fozia came up with a proper scholarly title. And then I felt, well, we don't get the gaze of potential audience for the talk. So I thought that human zoo will be more appealing, and it is interesting how these things work. And I really loved what you said about this mea culpa scholarship and approach, and to see this whole thing in how these things are presented in through very narrow and kind of selfish lenses, even today. So yeah, well, that may be one thing to be discussed in the questions and answers. So I close the recording, and we start the discussion sessions. I will before that, but I will ask you to raise your digital or real hands in doing that, and or write in the chat that you have a question. So I want to say that about next week we will have Jonathan Brown, and what happens when God's law gives you unjust results. So very different, but immensely interesting talk. Maybe you can join us as well, Fozia, for it. And I put it into the chat. So see you everyone there. And yeah, now for the question.